If you want freedom, take pride in your country. If you want democracy, hold on to your sovereignty. And if you want peace, love your nation.
Look at a map of Europe 200 years ago. It's not that long ago, but you really wouldn't recognize the map. Most of the Western Europe was controlled by France. It rapidly subjugated Spain, Italy, Switzerland, and the future Germany, Croatia, and Slovenia. All of them fell like pawns before Napoleon Bonaparte's army. The only European country to openly oppose Napoleon was Britain, thanks in no small part to the fact that it wasn't separated from France by a land border that could easily be crossed, but by the English Channel, which at its narrowest point is 32 kilometers wide. This, however, didn't stop Napoleon. In 1806, the French fleet surrounded Britain, imposing a military and trade blockade on the island. Now Britain could neither buy nor sell anything to Europe. This seemed catastrophic, but not for everyone. British landlords actually benefited from all this, as they became the sole suppliers of grain to the British market. Over 10 years, from 1802 to 1812, the price of wheat in Britain doubled. During the years of the blockade, landowners became so accustomed to the good life that when Napoleon was defeated in the Battle of Nations near Leipzig and the continental blockade was lifted, none of them intended to lower prices. Of course, these were the wealthiest people in the country lobbying their interests in the British Parliament, so it's no wonder that when the blockade ended in 1815, prices didn't fall. The British Parliament passed the so-called Corn Laws under the pretext of protecting local farmers. Under these new laws, the import of grain into the country was banned until the price on the domestic market rose above 80 shillings per 13 kilograms. I understand that this number doesn't mean much to you. In modern money, this equates to roughly 33,000 pounds per ton of wheat. Do you know how much a ton of wheat costs today? 200 pounds. And no, not thousands, just 200 pounds sterling. And yes, the calculations are very rough because we're converting one currency to another and accounting for inflation, but the difference, by not tenfold but 100-fold, makes it clear that this absurd price ceiling under the Corn Laws was just a formality. It was never reached because landlords didn't need it to be. But by this time, Britain no longer relied solely on agriculture. It was becoming the cradle of the Industrial Revolution thanks to two things: coal and colonies. Territories in America, Africa, and Asia provided Britain with cheap resources and became excellent markets for goods, while abundant coal deposits made it possible to build industrial factories. If previously the main fuel for production was wood, which produced little energy and was quickly depleted, then with the discovery of rich coal reserves, the British transitioned from artisanal work to mass production in factories. As a result, everything came together: resources, markets, and fuel. Thus began Britain's Industrial Revolution, which led to urbanization and population growth. From 9 million in 1800, Britain's population grew to 17 million by 1850. In just 50 years, the population nearly doubled, and 80% of this population now lived not in villages but in cities. Naturally, when the majority of a country's population moves to cities, agriculture must become extremely efficient to feed them all. After all, a city dweller isn't a farmer who can grow something in their garden or go hunting. They have to buy their food, and when prices are high, an increasing portion of their wages is spent on survival. In this case, workers demand higher wages from industrialists, who in turn pressure the authorities. By the mid-19th century, fierce battles erupted in Britain between industrialists and landowners over the repeal of protectionist tariffs. One British banker even funded a magazine to promote the principles of free trade so that the public could read and understand how the Corn Laws were holding back Britain's economy. That magazine still exists today, and you might know it. It's called The Economist. The final straw of outreach came in 1845, when the Great Potato Famine broke out in Ireland. Potatoes, the main food staple in agrarian Irish society, were struck by disease. Most of the harvest was ruined, and even the cheapest food, potatoes, became unaffordable for most Irish people. But the land in Ireland belonged to British landlords, who couldn't have cared less about the plight of Irish farmers. They refused to lower rent payments, and when farmers couldn't pay, they were simply evicted. So while one ship sailed to Ireland with food collected by private charities, two other ships were leaving, carrying food out of Ireland to be sold profitably in Britain. As a result, mid-19th century Ireland experienced the most devastating famine in its history, which claimed the lives of more than 10% of the population. Clearly, the Corn Laws could no longer be tolerated. Pressure from all sides forced the British Parliament to repeal grain import restrictions in 1846. Immediately after this, cheap export grain flooded the British market, lowering the price of bread. It wasn't perfect, of course, but it was something. If before, many people could barely make ends meet, now they could spend more money on clothes and other household goods. This increased demand and stimulated the British economy. To back this up, within 50 years of repealing the Corn Laws, Britain's GDP tripled, from £50 billion to £150 billion. Yes, this economic growth depended on many factors, but it's hard to deny that the repeal of the Corn Laws was one of the most important. And here's something curious. After the repeal of the Corn Laws, Britain didn't just embrace the path of the free market. It began imposing this ideology on other countries. Take China, for example, which for centuries was one of the most powerful and self-sufficient empires. The Chinese produced silk, porcelain, and of course tea, which became especially popular in Britain. China wasn't very interested in buying anything from Europeans. Britain, however, had to pay for all Chinese goods with silver, threatening a shortage of the precious metal currency. In the end, Britain began exporting opium to China, which millions of Chinese men became addicted to. When Chinese authorities banned the import of this drug and burned the British contraband, Britain sent its steam fleet to Chinese shores, crushed the wooden Chinese ships, and forced the Chinese emperor to sign a humiliating treaty. In 1842, under this treaty, Chinese authorities ceded the island of Hong Kong to Britain and allowed Britain to trade freely in China. Oh, and Britain also forced China to compensate them for the destroyed opium. And China wasn't the only country where the principles of free trade were imposed. There are countless examples like this. Equally closed off like China was Japan in the mid-19th century. For 200 years, starting in the 17th century, Japan's government had pursued a policy of isolation after suppressing a Christian uprising. Once suppressed, the Japanese expelled all foreigners who had brought alien religions and sowed division. Naturally, they closed their borders. But in 1853, US Navy officer Matthew Perry sailed to Japan with 10 warships. He delivered the US government's demand to open Japanese ports for international trade. American whaling fleets were venturing further into the Pacific, and it was convenient for US ships to stop in Japanese ports to restock fuel, food, and fresh water. But the Japanese fiercely resisted, sinking American ships and imprisoning sailors. At first, the Japanese weren't impressed with Perry's proposal, but when he returned a year later and aimed cannons at Japan's capital city, Edo, the authorities realized they had no choice. In 1854, the Japanese signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, establishing peace and friendship with the United States. Under this treaty, the US gained the right to open consulates in the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate, and to expect assistance if American ships were in distress. This treaty marked the beginning of the end of Japan's isolation. It led to the fall of the existing government and triggered the Restoration Era, a period when Japan rapidly modernized to catch up with the advanced Western nations and become strong and independent. Naturally, this was so no one could ever again dictate with whom Japan could and couldn't trade. So what does this mean? Is the free market and mutually beneficial trade just a myth? And was the greatest economist in history, Adam Smith, wrong when he described the laws of the modern economy? In reality, those laws do work, but in favor of those who hold just a little more power than others. This map shows the leading exporters of the beans used to make one of the most popular beverages on our planet. Of course, we're talking about coffee. The majority of coffee beans in the world are grown in countries located near the equator: Colombia, Indonesia, and Vietnam. These countries belong to the so-called coffee belt, but the crown jewel of this belt is Brazil, whose coffee beans are in every third cup of coffee consumed worldwide. What might surprise you, however, is that for Brazil, the undisputed queen of coffee, coffee bean sales make up only 2% of its exports. It sells far more soybeans. In fact, agricultural exports are the primary source of revenue for Brazil's economy in global trade. But if we travel to the other end of the planet and look at Japan, we'll see that the situation in the land of the rising sun is entirely different. Japan primarily exports cars and equipment around the world. However, when it comes to food, including soybeans, Japan is forced to import it. This is because nearly 3/4 of Japan's land is covered by mountains and hills, leaving very little free land. Growing something like soybeans in Japan is simply not as profitable as it is in Brazil. Indeed, if we look at global trade statistics, we see that Brazil buys machinery, equipment, and chemicals from Japan. Meanwhile, Japan buys food and natural resources from Brazil. There's nothing surprising about this, because this is the foundation of international trade, described as early as the 18th and the 19th centuries by the founders of economics as a science, Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Simply put, they argued that each country should focus on what it does best. For Brazil, growing, harvesting, and exporting crops requires machines and equipment. Producing all of this from scratch domestically is unprofitable. It requires technologies that are either expensive or take a long time to develop. So it's easier to buy ready-made machines from Japan, which already has the expertise. And thus, Japanese machines are shipped to Brazil. In turn, Japan needs food. While its climate allows coffee beans to be grown in certain regions, it is very expensive. It's far cheaper to buy beans from Brazil, where production costs are much lower. Overall, this kind of trade benefits everyone, and it seems like it should work like clockwork. But if you dig a little deeper, you'll see that it's not so simple. Take a look at this map showing the distribution of production and sales for the American company Nike. More than half of all sales are concentrated in North America and Western Europe. Meanwhile, Asian, African, and South American countries account for less than a quarter share of sales, yet over 90% of the labor force is concentrated in those regions. It's not hard to guess why this happens. Look at the average salaries in the US, Vietnam, and China. If a factory worker in the US earns $30,000 a year, then in Vietnam, it's about $5,000. And that's why, starting in the 1970s, due to the rapid rise in living standards and wages in their own countries, companies from the US and Western Europe began moving their production to Asia. This brought the world a step closer to globalization, the very free market where countries trade with each other for mutual benefit. Wealthy countries provided jobs to poorer ones, while the poor countries grew their incomes and quickly caught up by adopting foreign technologies. By the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the American philosopher Francis Fukuyama wrote his famous book The End of History and the Last Man, it seemed that the era of endless wars was over, and the world would now live according to the principles of free trade and liberalism. Riding this wave, the World Trade Organization was founded in 1995, with over 50 countries joining, from Morocco to Australia. The idea was that the WTO would create equal economic rules for everyone, so countries could trade with each other according to unified standards and without high tariffs. All of this aimed to bring cheaper goods to markets and make the global economy more effective. But in practice, things turned out very differently. Look at West Africa. There, you'll find some of the poorest countries on the planet, which survive by exporting oil and cotton. Cotton, of course, is grown not only in Africa, but in dozens of regions worldwide. However, for poor African farmers, cotton production is the only way to feed themselves and their families. Naturally, cotton from African countries is very cheap. The average wage in Northwest Africa is at least 10 times lower than in the United States, even after taxes. Cotton production in Africa is also very cheap due to minimal depreciation and primitive land processing tools. Clearly, under free trade rules, African cotton should outcompete global rivals, but for some reason, this doesn't happen. Moreover, if you look at cotton prices today in different parts of the world, you'll see that US prices are among the lowest, despite the US being one of the most expensive places for labor and production. All of this is public information, and African countries began investigating how this was possible. The answer turned out to be simple. American farmers regularly receive billions of dollars in state subsidies, allowing them to sell cotton on the world market at lower prices. In other words, even if production is expensive and African producers threaten to outcompete them, subsidies ensure American farmers don't go bankrupt. The government funds their production and offsets costs, enabling exports at prices equal to or lower than Africa's. Indeed, if we examine the price trends for African cotton up until the 2000s, we'll see it was almost always cheaper than the global average. But after the WTO emerged, the price gap significantly narrowed. African countries lost around $250 million annually because their products were no longer as cheap in comparison. In the early 2000s, this led to a major conflict. Competition became unfair, and logically, the WTO should have intervened, since its purpose is to ensure fair and free trade. African countries thought so too, and in 2003, they filed a complaint with the WTO. Do you think this changed anything? The investigation dragged on for so long that it's still ongoing, and no real sanctions for violating free trade rules were imposed. Subsidies continue to this day despite all the violations. Moreover, after the 2000s, nearly all African leaders in cotton production saw their exports revenues drop significantly. For some, gold replaced cotton. For others, it was oil. How many African families were ruined by this free trade remains anyone's guess. How did it happen that the WTO, which claims to fight for free competition, turned out to be incapable of influencing a country, undermining the rules of free trade? The answer is simple. In a WTO, wealthy countries hold far more influence. Formally, all countries are equal. Each country has one vote, regardless of its economy's size. But in reality, this equality doesn't work. Wealthy countries have more money and resources to participate in negotiations. Imagine one side with a team of economists, lawyers, and diplomats well-versed in international law and trade agreements. On the other side is a delegation from poor African countries that may lack experts with such skills. It's like a national football team playing against a university team. The outcome is obvious. Additionally, major economies and corporations can lobby their interests in the WTO. Subsidies are not exclusive to the US. The European Union also subsidizes its farmers, spending a third of its budget on this today. It's reached the point where the WTO no longer considers subsidies a violation of free trade principles. It's all starting to look like a facade, where one thing is declared, but something entirely different happens in practice.
We suggested 3 years for a total end to subsidies. A solution has to be found for the millions of farmers who are living in abject poverty, dying of disease, starving because they can't earn enough money to make a decent living.
So those subsidies that have desirable other social goals, these are subsidies that the WTO agreement allows countries to pursue.
Alright, it seems clear what happens to poor countries. But what if a country refuses to play by someone else's rules? That's when a very interesting story begins. Do you remember 2017? It was a time when the world had pretty much recovered from the Great Recession of 2008 but had yet to experience the coronavirus, which would claim 7 million lives. Meanwhile, as the global economy was growing by 3.5%, Bitcoin increased in value 20-fold, and investors around the world were pouring money into stock markets. Overall, it was a wonderful and optimistic time. But suddenly, like a bolt from the blue, this happens.
And we have the big aluminum companies in the United States, and they've been very unfairly treated by bad policy, by bad trade deals, by other countries. They've been horribly treated by other countries. And it just kills, it destroys our companies and our jobs. And that's been happening for so many years.
Donald Trump declares that to import steel into the United States from another country, a tariff of 25% will have to be paid, and for aluminum, 10%.
It'll be 25% for steel. It'll be 10% for aluminum.
Why would the president of the most powerful economy in the world restrict the free market? After all, it's so beneficial. Trade with what you do best, and the global economy will grow. To understand the motives behind this political decision, take a look at this chart. It shows the US share of aluminum production in the global market. While at the end of World War II, the US produced nearly half of all aluminum on the planet, by 2017, it was less than 3%. The same trend happened with production volumes. From 4.5 million tons at its peak in 1980, the US dropped to just 1 million tons in 2017. This decline represents not just lost profits for American companies, but tens of thousands of vanished jobs and billions of dollars in lost tax revenue for the American budget. Who squeezed American aluminum out of the market? Someone who 30 years ago wasn't even considered a competitor: China. This chart clearly shows China's modern share of copper, nickel, aluminum, and other metals production. It is the undisputed leader and in some cases a monopolist. So when China in the 2000s began exporting metals globally, including to the US, with the help of cheap labor and government support, the US immediately imposed import tariffs to protect their producers and prevent their companies from going bankrupt. And Trump wasn't the first US president to limit foreign competition. In 2002, George W. Bush also imposed import tariffs on steel. Exceptions were made for neighboring Canada and Mexico, as well as developing countries like Argentina, Thailand, and Turkey, those that posed no threat. However, Japan, South Korea, and of course China fell under the tariffs. Listen to what Donald Trump, a billionaire and experienced businessman, says about these restrictions.
Because I believe in free trade. I want so much trade. You know, somebody said, oh, maybe he's a total nationalist, which I am in a true sense. But I want trade. I want great trade between countries. But the word free is very deceiving because it's good for them, it's not good for us. I want fair trade.
Trump, in other words, supports free trade, but quote-unquote fair free trade. Apparently, when you subsidize your farmers and push African cotton producers out of the market, it's considered proper and fair trade. But when another country uses the same methods against you, trade suddenly stops being fair.
It's been very unfair to us. And knowingly, we always have a minority, and it's not fair.
And no, I don't accuse the American government of hypocrisy because any politician will act in their country's best interests. But this story once again proves that the free market as a model taught to economics students doesn't exist in real life. Moreover, China is no Mali. They didn't just file a complaint with the WTO. They introduced retaliatory measures, practically ceasing to buy American soybeans. Haha, you might say, so what? Some soybeans. Big deal. But until 2018, China was the largest buyer of American soy, consuming about 60% of all US exports. When China stopped buying American soybeans in 2018, American farmers suffered massive losses because there wasn't another market comparable to China to sell all that soy at previous prices. As a result, Trump had to compensate farmers $11 billion from the US budget to prevent widespread bankruptcies. And this was the minimal cost of the stick that the US put in the wheels of the free market. And so it turns out that both China and the US suffer losses from the trade war but cannot stop it because each wants to be on top. This unfair struggle is the very principle of the free market that exists in reality, not in textbooks. Strong economies interfere in global trade and create rules favorable to themselves, which weaker economies are forced to follow. Furthermore, sometimes the governments of these weaker countries themselves agree to such conditions. Take Cambodia, for example, kingdom in Southeast Asia, located between Thailand and Vietnam. It's slightly larger than the Republic of Karelia. While Brazil exports soybeans and coffee, and Japan cars and machinery, Cambodia's economic foundation is not resources, chemicals, or agriculture, but garment manufacturing. Cambodia is where Adidas tracksuits, H&M t-shirts, and Zara dresses are made. The reason is simple. Cambodia sells what it has in abundance at the lowest price: labor. 10 years ago, the average wage at a Cambodian textile factory was about $90 per month, a criminally low amount even for such a country, where the living wage at the time was estimated at $120. But for many Cambodians, working at these factories was the only source of income. Over 700,000 people were employed at major clothing brand factories, while the total population was 15 million. Exclude the elderly and children, and you'll find that about 8% of the population worked at these factories. These people, who had to feed their families, earned below the living wage. In 2014, the situation boiled over. More than 10,000 workers marched through Cambodia's capital, handing out stickers and t-shirts reading, "We need $177. Workers demanded an increase in the minimum wage to $177 per month, an amount they believed would at least allow them to make ends meet. I'll give you 3 seconds to guess how companies and the governments reacted to these protests. Wages were indeed raised, but not by $80, only by $30. And then the police crushed the protests. You'd think the authorities would support their people, but foreign investors could easily move production to neighboring countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, or Myanmar, where people were willing to work for even less. And let me remind you again that more than half of Cambodia's exports consist of clothing. If brands leave, the country's revenues will collapse. And needless to say, none of the Western companies worried about the crackdown on protests because raising wages was completely unprofitable for their business. And in Cambodia, nothing has radically changed since. The country is stuck in a vicious cycle. The government has nothing to offer foreign investors except cheap labor, and investors will scatter if they start supporting the demands of the poor population. And this is the essence of the modern economy and world order. For decades, economists and politicians have convinced us that an open market and fair competition are essential for a strong and prosperous economy. And it's hard to argue with that. Look at the countries topping the economic freedom rankings. At the top, we see Singapore, Switzerland, and other developed nations. These are countries with some of the highest living standards in the world. But the further down you go in this table, the more surprised you'll be. The world's three most powerful economies, the US, India, and China, rank 25th, 126th, and 151st respectively. In these countries, the state intervenes in the economy as strictly as possible, imposing tariffs, subsidizing domestic production, and granting tax breaks, all to ensure that domestic corporations can compete equally in the fair global market. And if you're strong enough, you'll retaliate and impose your own tariffs. But if you're not, you'll be forced to play by the rules of the free market set by others.